Hi everyone, welcome to the Civil Rights Movement Part 2, Lecture 3. And this is actually going to be our very last very last lecture in this unit. And this is on the women's movement. So to get us started, I would like you to think about these three questions. Number one, what does the word feminist mean? Okay? You don't have to go look it up, but just think about in your brain, maybe what have you heard that it means, or what definition might come to mind. And then what is the connotation of the word? And if you're unfamiliar with the word connotation, it means essentially our feeling around the word. So for example, is feminism a negative word, a positive word? What sort of emotions are tied into or feelings are tied into the word feminism? And then lastly, I want you to consider or think about whether you consider yourself a feminist. Would you be okay if somebody labeled you as that? Or do you think that your beliefs align with what a feminist is? All right, so the definition of feminism or feminist is a person who believes in the political, social, and economic equality of the sexes. Sometimes this definition uses the word advocate, so somebody who advocates or fights for or promotes the idea of equality between the sexes. And so I want you to think about, if you look at just this pure definition, right? To kind of go back to these three questions and think about how does that maybe change your answer to any of these things. And then if we're talking about somebody who just believes in the equality of the sexes, so when it comes to political, social, economic equality, what does that have to do with the connotation or the way that maybe we use that word in society? And is that connected to what the definition actually means? Particularly if you are somebody who thought that the word feminism had a negative connotation. I want you to ask yourself why. Why maybe do we imply that there's a negative feeling toward the word feminism if all it's talking about is the equality, or that men and women are considered equal or should be considered equal? Okay? And also, if this is just the pure definition that they're equal or that we all are equal, then shouldn't you consider yourself a feminist? Aren't you all a feminist? And so if you're saying, no, I'm not, then I ask you to really challenge yourself. Why, if all this word means is that we are equal, what is it that would hold you back from that definition? All right. Kind of as we're moving from some of the other movements we talked about to talk about the women's movement or the women's liberation movement, I threw this out here because it's kind of an important thing to think about. And this quote says, "Society can't seem to separate the sexual revolution and women's liberation." And I point that out because what they're referring to as the sexual revolution is part of kind of the counterculture movement, the kind of freeing of limitations or norms when it comes to our relationship with other people. And for some reason, much of society thinks that these things have to come together. And so that women who are participating in women's liberation or fighting for equal rights must necessarily be part of the sexual revolution. And that's not necessarily true. They're separate things. And we might think about as women's liberation as a political movement or a social movement to create equity or equality. And that might be quite different than what was happening in lots of the counterculture. All right. Kind of before we go any farther, really think about maybe why or how pervasive sexism is, even in 2020, even though we're going to talk about some of the successes. I'm going to play you this affirmation. And this woman, if you're unfamiliar with her, this is AOC, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is the youngest woman to ever be elected and to serve in Congress. And there was a documentary that was made about her and some other people running for Congress, and this is it. It's on Netflix. And there's this moment where she talks about that she's going to go out for a debate, essentially. And this is what she tells herself. And I think it's powerful to kind of show who she is, but also maybe some of the things that we do to pep ourselves up or prep ourselves if we're going into something that might be tough. So I'll go ahead and play that for you.
I am experienced enough to do this. I am knowledgeable enough to do this. I am prepared enough to do this. I am mature enough to do this. I am brave enough to do this. And this whole thing, this whole time, he's going to tell me I can't do this. He's going to tell me I'm small, that I'm little, that I'm young, that I'm inexperienced.
All right. So again, that's just kind of the little pep talk that she gives herself. So again, you might think about what kind of things you do to tell yourself that you are competent, that you are able to do it, even if the world is going to underestimate you or discount you. And women, you might have more experience with that than some others. All right. And then we're going to kind of go back to our African American civil rights. And I want you to think about kind of where did we leave off with issues when it came to African American civil rights, or kind of the successes that were made at that moment. And to kind of bridge that, or to get you to think about the connection between race and gender, I have this image from the Super Bowl 50, from a couple years ago. And at that, you have this incredible performance at the halftime show of Beyonce, including Bruno Mars and Coldplay. And I think Beyonce is a really interesting person to kind of connect those issues of race and gender, because she talks about them and she embodies them in her music and the way that she kind of promotes herself and the things that are important to her. Another reason you might think about that, I'm sorry, I'm blocking Beyonce, we wouldn't want to do that, these are her outfits and her dancers' outfits from the performance on the top. And you can tell that they are meant to be modeled off of those from the Black Panthers, or the women Black Panthers in the 1960s and early 1970s. And so she's bringing those things together to kind of bring awareness to some of kind of current issues. And a lot of her activism is very much kind of putting or connecting those issues of race and gender in her music and what she does. So, for example, this was quite controversial, her outfits. There were even police officers that said that they would not be security for her concerts and things like that after this came out. But she has been very supportive of activists in the last couple of years, and done all sorts of different things. But one of the things that she's done, and she and Beyonce have done, is to put up bail money essentially for activists who are arrested because of their activism. So she is absolutely involved in those things. Oh, and I know why I have those on there. Sorry. One of your journal options for this week is to look at 2 Beyonce songs. So to look at Formation, which is where these images come from, but you'd watch the actual video, as well as Flawless, because in both of those, she is really talking about women, and particularly Black women. And so that might help you kind of think about issues that we would see in the 60s and the 70s, as well as how those manifest themselves in 2020. There are quite a bit of questions, but you do get to watch 2 Beyonce videos. So think about whether that's the option you want to do. I am very much sad that we don't get to have this conversation together, because it's always a fun and important conversation. And we get to watch Beyonce, so. All right, but from there, we're going to kind of move into the meat of the women's movement, or what is often considered the second wave of a women's movement. And that's because if you remember, we did the 19th Amendment in the last unit, and that's kind of the first wave, essentially the women getting the right to vote with that 19th Amendment in 1920. So we're just at the 100-year mark of that. But that's really important, because much like we talked about with African American civil rights, we're not talking about getting them the right to vote. We're not talking about winning the right to vote for African Americans or for women. It's about protecting that right or expanding those rights. So don't be that person that tells me that the women's movement in the 1960s and 1970s or getting women the right to vote, because it's about much more than that. Okay. All right, but a little bit more context for this women's movement that we're talking about right here. If you remember back to World War II, where we have a major labor shortage, many women went to work. They went to work in the defense industry, in factories, for the military, doing really important, necessary jobs. But then when the war is over, they're essentially told that their place is at home and that they need to go back to home. They need to go have a bunch of babies, produce the baby boomers, and kind of be happy in their suburban housewife's life. And for many women, they start to have some questions. It's like, is that all there is to life? I just look after my children. I just make sure my husband is happy, and that's it. And so you're going to start to see a little bit of movement. Some of that movement comes from this woman right here, and her name is Betty Friedan. And we'll get to her in just a second. But one of the other things we see is JFK's commission. So before he's assassinated, while he's in office, it's going to be a commission to essentially look at women in the United States and kind of what's going on with women in the United States. And it's crazy. But this commission says, hey, there's a lot of inequality. There are a lot of issues. Go figure. I do also want to point out, though, that while many women are going to start questioning their role as housewives and that's all there is to their life, please remember that lots of women don't have that experience. For lots of women, it's not possible for them to be housewives or to just stay home. Many of them are in the workforce. They have the economic realities mean that they too are working. All right. But in 1964, we're going to get the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act, which we talked about with African American civil rights, is supposed to end segregation and discrimination. It actually says along race and gender. And the gender part is thrown into the Civil Rights Act to essentially make it so controversial or change society so much that nobody would possibly vote for it. But that strategy actually backfires. So the Civil Rights Act talks about, again, race and gender. But there is an office, this should be an E, it should be the Equal Employment and I keep forgetting Equal Employment Office, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I don't know why that one is so hard for me, but the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And their job is to essentially investigate these claims of discrimination, but they don't take issues of gender discrimination serious. So if you are trying to make that claim, the office is essentially going to laugh at you. I'm crazy, but that's a problem. All right, this thing right here where it says Mad Men and Joan, this is just a connection to one of your journal possibilities. As you start to do your journals, or you should definitely be in the middle of your journals right now as you're watching this video, since this is the last one. Mad Men is the show that I've shown you a couple of clips from, but there's a character named Joan, and you're going to kind of see her experience in the workforce at this time, and she is going to experience lots of issues. So it's about, I think, a 20-minute long clip. So that's an option as well if you would like. I encourage you to check it out even if you don't do it with your journal question. All right, so this woman again, Betty Friedan, who's right here. She writes this book, and this is going to really kind of jumpstart that conversation about what is it that women are doing, and what is it that's going on with women? Why are they unhappy? Kind of where they're at. And so this is just a quote from her book. And she says, the problem was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, laid beside her husband at night, she was afraid to even ask of herself the silent question, is this all? So she's kind of putting the words to what some women are feeling, and she's kind of sparking this conversation about where are women in society, and maybe where should they go? What should they be allowed to do, or what does equality look like, or what should it look like in the United States? And so she's going to be one of the founding members of NOW, which is the National Organization of Women, and she's going to be their first president. However, as we kind of go through this movement, she's going to be far too moderate for feminists in the 1970s. She does not have a great record when it comes to women of color, when it comes to the LGBT community. And so she will essentially kind of get left behind as they continue to move. She'll kind of be a thorn in their side as they try to keep move on. And I point that out because this is actually something we've talked about with other movements as well. I mentioned this with the LGBT community, that some of the early publications that we see in the 1940s, 1950s are too conservative or too moderate, I should say, as kind of the pride parades and pride movements kind of move forward. You might also think about that same thing with like MLK. There's going to be a moment where MLK is too moderate for Black Power or the Black Panthers or even for SNCC. So even though there are people that really start those conversations or really push a movement, sometimes they don't keep pace with the way that movement continues forward. All right. So a little bit more of the backdrop to those women's movement. The FDA is going to approve the pill in 1960, so the birth control pill. A couple years after that, the Supreme Court will also say that it's constitutional for women and married couples to use the pill. We get the publishment of the book and the Civil Rights Act, which I mentioned on the last slide. Actually, I should actually go back to this thing about the birth control pill. That's really important because that starts, that gives women a lot of control over their own bodies and the decisions that they're making that will affect their life. Your life might be more complicated. Your options might be more limited if you have children. So being able to determine whether you do or you don't have children is really important for women who would like equality and they'd like to determine their own future. All right. But what is now calling for? What is the National Organization of Women calling for? And we might think about it similar to, our Bill of Rights or the Black Panthers 10-point plan. They're going to kind of lay out these things that they want. So number one, they want the ERA, which is the Equal Rights Amendment, which I'll talk about in the next slide, I believe. They want equal employment opportunity, and they want it to be treated as seriously as racial discrimination, which I mentioned is included in the Civil Rights Act, but is not in reality or de facto being taken care of. They want maternity leave and benefits and no penalty for having to take time off to have children. That's really important. This is also a major issue today. We have one of the worst records in the world when it comes to how much leave we allow either women or even men when it comes to having children. And there's a massive gap when it comes to wealth inequality, when it comes to those who have children or who have to take time off, particularly when it comes to combining the issues of race and gender. All right, tax deductions for working parents, so they can write off essentially childcare and things of that nature. Childcare is a community resource. So essentially, much like maybe a K-12 school is a community resource, it's a free resource, not free resource, but something that we all have access to because we pay taxes. Equal education, unsegregated, equality in the process. So that women have access to all schooling, that they can go to college, that they can go to law school, that they can become a professor, that they can have all those opportunities that men have had. And so again, you might see some connections between issues of gender and issues of race. Equal access to welfare benefits, and they can stay home to raise their kids if they would like. And this might perk some of your interests. Why should they be able to stay home and access welfare benefits to raise their kids? Why shouldn't they go back to work? We know scientifically from research that it is good to have parents home with their kids, particularly young kids. And we also know that childcare is incredibly expensive. So if you're saying that people have to go back to work and maybe they're in a minimum wage job, how is it that they're supposed to be able to pay for childcare if they're in that minimum wage job? And so how do we kind of find a balance between these things? Does it make sense to make childcare a community resource that we can all access and then have people go back to work but offer welfare benefits? This is a complicated thing. I think it's also something that we are still struggling with. How do we make sure that we take care of kids and at the same time that many of us feel strongly about not allowing people to take advantage of the system, particularly things of welfare? And that's also a really complicated topic and something, again, that I really wish that we were together so that we could have a legit conversation about when we say that we value life or that we want to make sure that people have opportunities. What does that actually look like? And it's far more complicated than the sound bites that we hear in the news. All right, and then the last one is the right to decide when and if they have children and access to information. So whether that's through the pill, whether that's through access to other contraceptives, whether that is abortion, or just access to information that so women can make the best decisions for themselves, that they are empowered to make decisions for themselves. All right. Some of the places that you see this kind of manifest is in journalism. And so there are some female journalists or some employees at some publications that are going to start protests. They're going to start asking some questions. And so this is a case at the Ladies' Home Journal, and there's a sit-in and a lawsuit that will ultimately lead to very slow change. There is a show on Amazon called The Good Girls Revolt about this experience. So it might be something you want to check out. We also see legal challenges. And one of the people that is really challenging gender inequality in the United States is this woman right here. And I can't believe I'm covering part of her face. We would never do that to her. This is RBG, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she is a lawyer who is one of the founders of the Women's Rights Project. And she's going to challenge these cases of inequality. And she actually brings a bunch of them to the Supreme Court. She's the lawyer that takes them all the way to the Supreme Court, and she wins something like 5 out of 6 of her cases. In the 1990s, she is appointed to the Supreme Court. She's still on the Supreme Court. She is 87 years old, and she is an incredible woman. This woman is still working out. You can look up RBG's workouts online. And again, she's in her 80s. She has had 4 rounds of cancer, and she's been in and out of the hospital for different things in the last couple of years. And she continues to work and will go right back to work as soon as she gets out of the hospital. And right now, since we are all in quarantine, she was actually just in the hospital. She had an infection in her gallbladder, and they are actually doing arguments over the phone. And so she did hers from the hospital. She listened in to the oral arguments from the hospital and asked some really tough questions while she is there being treated for these things. So she is a tough, tough cookie. But one of the reasons that people love her is she is very sharp with her words. And when she's unhappy about something, you know it. And she's been pretty dang famous for her dissents. And in the Supreme Court, if you dissent, that means that you are in the minority. So the majority determines what's going to happen with the case, but she's known for her dissent and kind of writing these scathing pieces about why she thinks that the majority is wrong. And when she does that, she wears a special collar, like you can see right here, and that you can see is on my shirt because I love RBG. And this indicates that she's going to be writing a dissent, or she is in the dissent. And so there are many people that love RBG and are very concerned about her health and trying to make sure that she survives just a little bit longer. People adore her. In the last couple of years, there's a really good documentary that came out about her, which interviews her, and she goes through her closet and shows you all of her dissent collars, many of which people have sent to her. And then there's a Hollywood version that was made about her life recently as well. So if you need something to make you feel good, and you just want to learn about an incredible woman, I suggest you maybe check that out. Also, she's not even 5 feet tall. She's just this little firecracker that I just love. You just can't help but love RBG. All right. All right, but then sometimes there's some interesting ways that we look at history well. This is the Olympian Wilma Rudolph, and she is an Olympian runner, but she's also a civil rights activist. And there seems to be far more focus on her role as an Olympian and less attention to her role as an activist. So this is another example for us to think about, what stories do we tell? What part of people's history do we focus on, or do we continue to tell? When really we should maybe be talking about all of it. Or we have this case. This is Billie Jean King. She was a famous tennis player. And in the 1960s, she participates in what is known as the Battle of the Sexes. And so this man, I can't remember his name, but he's a jerk. He is a male tennis star, or he was a male tennis star. He's at the end of his career. And he is not very nice when it comes to issues of gender. He's definitely a misogynist. And so he's going to challenge a woman to a match. And Billie Jean King will take him on and win. She also is a lesbian, and that comes out much later in her life. But so she is an important figure when we're talking about women's history and LGBT history. And then here she is with the Williams sisters. So thinking of that legacy of women in sports. Her story also just got made into a movie with Emma Stone and Steve Carell. So you might also check that out. It's pretty good. All right, and then we get Gloria Steinem. She's this incredible journalist and activist, and she's very much participating in the women's movement and a magazine that's called Miss Magazine, which you can check out as well. It's also still around, I think, in a small publication, or at least online. And she gets her start actually by going undercover as a Playboy bunny to talk about what's going on there. So you can also find that as well. All right, and then one of my favorite things that I've seen while we've been gone is this new show that is on Hulu or FX called Mrs. America. And it is talking about a lot of these female activists from this era and kind of their role in creating change in the United States. It's pretty dang incredible. It's almost done. I think there's a couple episodes left. So I strongly encourage you to check it out. And it's my favorite thing. I've mentioned it a couple times. But if you have access to Hulu or FX, I encourage you to check it out. All right, and one of the things, or the essentially premise of that show, is what is known as the Equal Rights Amendment, or the fight over what would have been the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay? So essentially, we might think about this as a battle between Betty Friedan and the other women's activists and Phyllis Schlafly. Okay? She's going to be the anti-ERA person. Okay? So what the women activists want, the feminists want, is these three things. This would be one of only 27 or 28, I guess if this gets past, amendments. And it says, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article, and that this amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. So that's all it says. That's the complete text of what it says. And there is actually bipartisan support for this Equal Rights Amendment. Both Republican and Democrat presidents, Democrat and Republican members of Congress, First Ladies, all these people are supportive of it. And so it will actually pass Congress. And then after it passes Congress, the way that you get an amendment is it has to be ratified by the states. So the states start to ratify it, and then Phyllis Schlafly pops up. And Phyllis Schlafly, I would argue, is an evil genius. She essentially single-handedly takes out the ERA, which you can kind of see, which you see in Mrs. America if you watch that show. But some of you might be kind of like, what? Wait, a woman takes out the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, the only constitutional protection besides the right to vote that women would have? She single-handedly defeats that? And the answer is yes. She starts this campaign and combines all these different kinds of women, particularly religious women, conservative religious women, to rally states against the amendment. And the language that she uses to persuade people that there's something inherently wrong with the ERA or that this would be bad for society is she says things like, oh no, it's going to threaten traditional gender roles. Okay? Women should be able to stay home and take care of their kids if they want to. Oh no, it will destroy families. Oh no, everybody will be using the same bathroom. Those arguments never come back. Oh no, women are going to be drafted. It's the middle of Vietnam. Oh no, this is going to destroy families. It's going to ruin things. And so she's really selling this agenda that the ERA, rather than providing protection for women, will destroy the fabric of the morals in the United States. And I would argue that while she is going full force on the ERA, she also has another agenda. And what she's doing is getting a lot of these women who maybe had not participated in politics before, or definitely different religious groups that did not typically get involved with religion, to come out. And she's helping turn the country in a more conservative way. She's kind of setting the stage for what will be known as the new right that will support the election of Ronald Reagan in about 10 years. But she's laying the early groundwork for that. And she's using the ERA as essentially her first battle. Many people are incredibly frustrated with Phyllis Schlafly because she is pretty hypocritical. Like, she's talking about that women should be able to stay home and take care of their children and all these different things. But she herself is a lawyer who is leading this movement. So the same time that she's arguing that women should stay home and not challenge systems, she's doing exactly that. And she is really good at getting underneath the skin of different feminists and really altering and distorting the narrative. The version of the ERA that she sells is not at all what was meant by the ERA. But she knows that if she phrases things a certain way, if she sells this false narrative, it's still in people's minds and it will get people to turn against it. So that's why I call her an evil genius, because when it comes to politics, she is incredibly brilliant. But I think it has an incredibly negative consequence for the United States. There's actually lots of conversations about whether we need an amendment today. And I mentioned it, but you might not have caught it. The only protection that women have in the Constitution is the right to vote. Nothing else in that document protects women. And then you might say, well, there's laws, et cetera, things don't seem that bad right now. But laws are really easy to get rid of. All it takes is another Congress. All it takes is a president that does not believe in gender equality, who does not believe in equality, or wants to undo these things to do that. Amendments, once they're there, they stand. We know that there's 27 amendments, and only one of them have been overturned. So you can get that amendment. It is stuck. It is a good form of protection, and they are something that we in this country take very seriously. So I would argue that it is incredibly important that we find a way to get this in the Constitution. And even though we're talking about something that happens in the 70s, there's actually a continued fight to get the Equal Rights Amendment. If you are familiar with John Oliver, he did an episode about it earlier in the year. There are quite a few F words and some not cartoons, but jokes that I could not say in class. But if you are interested in this and you feel like this is something that you are up to, you might check it out. If you don't have HBO, the clip is on YouTube. It's linked right here. And I think he does a really good job of highlighting why we need an ERA in 2020. And then maybe we're getting closer. Maybe this will actually happen. Virginia was one of the states that did not approve the ERA, and they actually just approved it in 2020. And so even though like the timeline for the states passing it has passed, the Senate could go back and change that and actually ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So it is possible. There are enough states that support it. Congress passed it at one point in their history. So there is the potential for the ERA to actually happen, something like 40 years later, but perhaps we'll get there. All right. One of the other major challenges that we see when it comes to the women's movement is on the issue of abortion. At this time, all the different states have different laws or rules when it comes to abortion. But this Supreme Court case in 1973 will say that women do have the right to some abortions. So it will say that some abortions are constitutional. And there's a really strange thing that the Supreme Court does, and you can click on that video if you would like. They essentially say that women and their doctors have the ability to make that decision in the first trimester, that the state or the government cannot step in that first trimester. In that second trimester, it's up to women and her doctor until we get to a point where that fetus is viable, or where that baby would survive on its own if it was born. And then the third trimester, they say essentially that the state has the right to regulate what happens. That trimester system is less than scientific, particularly in 2020, and creates a lot of room to kind of push back or limit women's right to make that choice for themselves. We know that abortion is still a very, very controversial thing in the United States, and essentially since Roe, states have done a pretty successful job at preventing women from actually accessing those rights. There's all different strategies that states take to try and prevent people from accessing this right, or for women from accessing this right. And we see that a lot actually right now. We've seen states really challenge this. So, for example, Georgia signed a fetal heartbeat abortion law just last year. Other states have challenged Roe v. Wade in the last couple of years. This is actually one of the reasons that there's been a major fight over the Supreme Court in the last couple of years and who gets appointed. Because the more conservative the Supreme Court is, the more likely that they'll roll back Wade or get rid of the constitutional protections of women's right to choose. And that's an important thing. It's something that people feel very strongly about. The other thing is, if Roe v. Wade, or if the right to abortion is one of the most controversial things in the United States, and I argue that it is, it's this thing that we kind of go to our corners and we don't talk to each other about. We just yell the same thing over and over again. It might be important for us to think about, where are some points of agreement? Maybe not everybody is going to agree about a woman's right to choose, or whether a woman should have the right to choose what to do with her own body. But we might be able to agree that that unwanted pregnancies is something that we could work to stop. So how do you do that? How do you make sure that people have access to information so that they can get and make their best decisions for themselves, so that you could maybe reduce the number of abortions that are sought, and get closer to what all parties want? Okay? I also challenge you to think about where people are hypocritical when it comes to regulations. So, for example, if we think about kind of where liberals and conservatives tend to be in the United States, if you identify as conservative, you are more likely to be against abortion, but for the Second Amendment. So you want to regulate what women can do with their bodies, but you don't want people to regulate your access to firearms. If you are liberal, you are more likely to support abortion, but want to regulate firearms. So you want women to have the right to choose to make decisions for themselves, but you don't want all people to have access to firearms. You want restrictions on that right. So in both of those, maybe you could talk about that people are being hypocritical, and why is it that people want some regulation but not on other things, and vice versa. All right. Sort of one of the last things that we see in the women's movement is this event in 1977. Okay? And at one hand, you have the National Women's Conference, this major kind of coming together of all these women activists, supported by the federal government, paid for by part of the federal government, bipartisan. And then across town, you have this pro-family movement in Houston. So both of these major events in the same city, the same weekend, and very different ideas about what is right and what is wrong, and the direction that the country should be going. So at the National Women's Conference, you see that the feminists are going to expand their platform, what it is that they're fighting for, or what it is that they think that they should protect. It's more inclusive of the LGBT community and people of color, women of color, because that had been a major criticism of the women's movement, that it was mostly a upper middle class white women's movement and not fully recognizing the issues of a larger group of people. But across town, Phyllis Schlafly are labeling themselves as the protector of families. They're creating this sort of false narrative that if you support feminism, you're against family. That somehow women being able to determine what their future looks like challenges or threatens families in the United States. And they're repeating a lot of inaccurate information, but they know Schlafly is famous for knowing and recognizing that if you repeat it enough times, people start to believe it. Okay? So, for example, if Schlafly is spreading this thing about burning bras and that's what feminists do, that's what people remember. I bet you've heard that before. Guess what? It never happened. Phyllis Schlafly might help you think about where we are as a nation right now. If some of you who have been really into conspiracy theories around COVID-19 or hearing things, and we maybe don't check to see if those are accurate, but we hear them repeated enough, people continue to post them over and over again without checking to see if they're accurate. Those things get stuck in our brain. So even if somebody comes out and double checks it or takes it off of YouTube, all anybody remembers is that thing, not that it's not accurate. And that's terribly harmful. It prevents us from having an honest conversation and making the best decisions for ourselves based off of accurate information. But it's effective. And Phyllis Schlafly is really good at understanding that you should use media to your advantage and that the loudest voice gets the most attention. So the more she's yelling or talking about these things and the louder that she is, the more attention that those get. But you have all these women who believe that they were fighting for what is best for women, but they clearly disagree. And so you're maybe seeing some maybe similarities between some disagreements we've seen in other movements, maybe in the African American civil rights groups, or maybe even some similarities between the Democrats at that moment. And I have it on here as LBJ's Democrats, but essentially the divide between the Democrats who are going to continue to be segregationists and Dixiecrats and be resistant to change versus the Democrats that are going to be supportive of civil rights. You again are kind of seeing that move in the women's movement. So those who are supportive of a more progressive, helping a larger group of people, protecting civil rights and civil liberties versus those who want to kind of keep the status quo the way that it is. All right, but where are we now? So now, and a lot of those female activists are fighting things for things through publications, Miss Magazine, through the court system. That's one of the things that now is famous for, and protests and boycotts and things like that. How successful were they on their goals, on their Bill of Rights? And I would argue, actually not that successful, but they are changing the conversation, and it's part of a slow change to create equality or get us as close to equality as we are in 2020, which we know we're not quite there yet. Okay, but one of the last victories maybe we could talk about is what is known as Title IX. This happens in the 1970s. And it essentially says that federally funded educational institutions or prohibits federally funded educational institutions from discriminating against students or employees on the basis of sex. So we think about this a lot when it comes to education. This is why we have women's sports, why women's sports are protected or supposed to be protected. I don't know what happened to football because you have women's soccer, men's soccer, women's basketball, men's basketball. I don't know what happened to football. I'll let you guys determine that one. Okay. But also supposed to protect women from sexual harassment and assault claims as well. Title IX specifically will say no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subjugated to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So again, if a school receives funding, they have to provide equality. So whether it's elementary, whether it's high school, whether it's university, all of those different things. It's complicated. It's less than perfect. Do they have to have the same number of people that are participating, the same number of sports, the same playing time, the same amount of money that is used, the same media attention, all those different things. And then, of course, we have Miss Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education right now. And she has decided that, particularly on college campuses, that we give too much, I'm trying to think of what word to use, too much protection to those who are victims of sexual assault or make accusations of sexual assault, and that we need to protect those who are accused more. Sexual assault is already a very complicated and touchy system in the United States, and we've made progress in the last couple of years of believing women or helping women, and many people view these protections for those who are accused as a step backwards, but it's where we are. All right, and then we can talk about sports some more. Miss Dietrich is not a soccer person. Sorry, guys. But I do know a little bit about women's soccer in the United States and that they are pretty incredible and they win a lot, far more than our men. But do you think that they are paid the same? Absolutely not. So the women's soccer team have continued to file against U.S. soccer essentially and fight for equal pay. And they feel like they have a very strong case because A, they deserve it, because they're doing a similar job. They're also playing soccer, but also that they've definitely proven themselves as they are far better, far superior to the men's soccer team or U.S. soccer team. But just recently, a judge ruled against them, and so they are appealing that. This has been a battle that they've been fighting for years, and we're going to have to wait and see how it turns out. And I don't know what I'm doing with my life. All right. So I just talked about soccer, but some other things you might think about. Abortion is still controversial. Women's economic standing is still controversial. What is expected of women is still controversial. You know, in the last unit, I showed you guys a list of what housewives were expected to do. And so you might think about what would that list have today? What is it that we expect women to do? What is it that we expect married women to do? What obligations do we think that women must meet? Must they have children? Must they work? Must they cook dinner? Things of that nature. Also, in April, this year, it's in April, we have what's known as Equal Pay Day. And what Equal Pay Day is a recognition of the economic inequality in the United States, the income inequality when it comes to gender. And essentially, it is how long a woman would have to work, the average woman would have to work to meet the man's average salary. So a woman would have to work all of 2019 and through April 2020 to make the same amount of money that the average man made in 2019. So essentially an additional four months. And it's not perfect. They're just looking at averages. They're not looking at particular fields and things like that, but they're showing you that there's this massive gap. And when you compound that with issues of race, or you combine race and gender, it's even wider than it is just for the average man and the average woman. It's also more complicated because women are more likely to work in the service industry. They're more likely to work part-time jobs. They're more likely to have to take time off for children and things like that. And all of those make the inequality even worse. And we might think about that right now when we are in a pandemic, and many of those service jobs, those waitress jobs and things like that are correct. Me too. When it comes to issues of sexual harassment and assault, we've definitely made some progress, or definitely drawing attention to those issues with the Me Too movement, and really trying to hold those responsible for their actions. Women's March, we've definitely seen a lot of activism and political movements on behalf of women in the last couple of years. Starting in 2017, there's been marches every year, and really trying to use the number of women, we make up 51% of the population, to push things in a certain direction. All right, there are more women, than most women ever in Congress. In this last session of Congress, they make up 106 people in Congress. 79 of them are Democrats and 27 of them are Republicans. That is just under 20% of the total people of Congress. So you can clearly see that there's still an issue if we make up 51% of the population, but only 20% of Congress. We definitely are underrepresented. 22% in the Senate and 19.3% in the House. But we have seen much more women run for office, much more women run for Congress and President of the United States, which we saw in the 2020 election or the Democratic primaries. But we're continuing to see issues of sexism in the election, as well as some other issues. Already there are allegations against both Biden and Trump and their relationship with women. Biden's, I think, we're still working out what actually happened, or the depth of those allegations. But the president himself has been accused by more than a dozen women of sexual harassment or assault. But those are our two candidates for the president of the United States. Those are our only options. Both men who have been accused of inappropriate relationships or interactions with women. If you are a woman in 2020, that doesn't seem like a great place to be honest with you. But those are our options. To be honest, we're talking about that our only options in 2020 as of right now are two white men who are in their 70s and have a less than ideal past. And so this is a frustrating moment for many people to think about, like, this is where we are, this is how much we've fought in the past, and these are still our options. We still have to make a choice about a lesser of two evils if you don't like either one of those people, or you were upset that they're not perfect candidates. But it's important that we still think about who creates an opportunity to push things in the direction that you want to see them pushed. But somebody who has a lot to say about elections and women is Elizabeth Warren. And she was asked after she ended or suspended her campaign, what role did gender play in the presidential campaign? And I think her response is perfect if we think about sort of the position that we put women in 2020, whether it's running for office or just our day-to-day lives. And she says, you know what? That is a trap question for women. If you say, yeah, there was sexism in this race, everyone says you're a whiner. And if you say, no, there was no sexism, about a bazillion women think, what planet do you live on? So there's this catch-22. If she claims that being a woman is why she lost, that people won't vote for women, people will say she's a whiner. If she shows any emotion, people will say that she's not fit for office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if she tries to take the other road and be like, oh, no, that's not what happened, the other women are going to be like, what planet do you live on? Absolutely, there is sexism, and it plays a role in who we see as electable in the United States, or who could run a Fortune 500 company, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And then the last sort of things to think about when we think about women's issues and where we are as a country right now. Are there any connections between gender and the pandemic, COVID-19? A couple of them. Number one, double shift. This is the term that we use to talk about women who work and then take care of children. So essentially, they have two jobs. Particularly for women who are at home working, trying to balance the majority of childcare. That's just what statistics show us in the United States, as well as trying to work. That they are doing an extra amount of work right now, or trying to figure out how to balance those two things in a way that men are not asked normally, or that the majority of men are not being asked to do. Questions of abortion, and this is actually an option for one of your journal entries. Many of the states have tried to stop abortion access during the pandemic because they say it's not essential medical needs, and so women can't access those things while we are in a crisis. And I urge you to think about, why would a state do that? Or do you agree that that's not an essential thing, that women could wait, or they just don't have that option when we're in the middle of a pandemic, particularly if you talk about that how long pregnancy lasts, or how long abortion is an option for women, and how long we think that this pandemic is going to last. And the last thing is, one of the unintended consequences of us being home so much is that there are people that are in unhealthy relationships, and we are seeing the number of domestic abuse cases rise because it disproportionately hits women, but that they are spending even more time stuck at home with an abusive partner. And how do we counter that with the pandemic, and also trying to help women who are in a situation like this? It's really complicated. All right. This is our last slide, I think. Yeah. This is just because it is our last lecture before you're going to do our assessment. So I just want to make sure that you're thinking about a couple of these things as you're planning your assessment. Number one, make sure you remember that this unit is not just African American civil rights, that it is all of these movements. It's plural. So if you're thinking of examples for your assessment, or you're thinking about how much change happened in this era, I want you to make sure that you're thinking about multiple movements. Make sure you think about economic and wealth issues when it comes to housing, when it comes to race, when it comes to gender. How do we see those things play out in this unit? Think about the presidents that are involved. You essentially have Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, and Nixon involved in this unit. Think about some of those important Supreme Court cases. Go back and look at the Earl Warren or the Warren Court. Think about, again, those multiple civil rights movements, so African American, LGBT, counterculture, women, Native American, Latinos. Think about what's happening in those. Difference between the nation and the trenches. So what is the government doing versus what are the people doing? How do the people push on the government? How does the government kind of push back? So think about those things, particularly in your first two questions on your assessment. Go back and try and see if you can label some of those major events or changes. That might also help you think about how you're going to write that question on your assessment. Think about some of those different activist groups. Particularly, I spent a decent amount of time talking about that in African American civil rights. So what's the difference between SALC and SNCC and the Black Panther Party? Who are some major individuals that you should know? Who are some allies of these movements? And then also think about the generation gap. So where do we see age or generations have different ideas about what is right and wrong, and how you fight for change, or if you fight for change, or how you challenge the government? And then the last thing, your last journal entry for this unit is having you compare and contrast a lot of this student activism, which essentially, particularly African American civil rights, a good hunk of it is done by young people. So whether that's K-12 kids, whether that's college kids. So there's student activism that is absolutely pushing the country in a direction. You're going to kind of compare and contrast that with the students from Parkland. And if you're unfamiliar with Parkland, that was the school shooting that happened in Florida, I think, 2 years ago. And even though we see school shootings on a regular basis now, unfortunately, the students in Parkland are different in that they, rather than being petrified by their fear or unable to respond because of sort of the complexities of kind of trying to heal from that, they've kind of turned that that moment of terror and that moment of sadness into activism. And they're very vocal about their activism and pretty dang successful in a very short amount of time trying to prevent gun violence at school and around the nation. So I want you to kind of compare and contrast how these young people have fought for change or how they've been able to change as a nation. Because whether we're talking about students in the 2000s or we're talking about the 1960s, I will once again reiterate that you guys are powerful. Young people are incredibly powerful, and that they are idealistic enough that they can see the world in a different way. And many times adults are too jaded and unwilling to kind of put themselves in uncomfortable positions to make change. And young people are idealistic and willing to do it. And the country reaps the benefits when young people want to make positive change. All right, I'm going to leave it there. If you need something from me, if you want help, particularly as you're formulating your answers to your assessment, let me go or let me know. Show up to our Zoom meeting. You can get some more help there too. All right, bye guys.